So we're going to get started. I know a couple people still be coming in, but I want to welcome you to WGBH. I'm Phil Rado. I'm the general manager for radio here in Boston and also for WGBH News. This is Boston Talks, and we're very happy that you're with us here tonight on what I guess feels like sort of the first night of fall, the actual first night of fall. The weather is turning. And one of the things about these opportunities is for people to come together in the same place, to be able to see each other and hear what I think is going to be a very interesting and important conversation tonight. We have a terrific and distinguished panel who we will get to in just a moment, and a great moderator in Beth Daley, who is a senior investigative reporter for the New England Center for Investigative Reporting, which we're very happy to say is based right here at WGBH News. And I would bet that you probably have read the report that she released about a week ago. It's quite interesting. If you haven't, I hope you will, and that will be what they are talking about a lot tonight. WGBH and NECIR have been working together for more than 2 years now, and we've joined forces for tonight's event, which kicks off an entire series that we're calling Investigates, Boston Talks Investigates. And it will be all about topics that our reporting teams and other people who are connected with WGBH are working on. And every event will be built somewhat similarly to tonight's, in that there will be a panel discussion around a topic, drawing upon primarily local experts, and then followed by an opportunity for your questions. Our goal overall with this kind of activity is to get all of us together to talk about what's happening in our world and what it means and how it may inspire the sort of serendipitous investigation on the topic or sidebars to the topic and speak to our curiosity. We have another event scheduled on November 16th, and you'll get all the specifics on it very soon. I will hint that it will be broadly about the topic of food, and Michael Pollan will be the guest. So I think that that's going to be another exciting evening. Now, before we get started, just a special thank you to those of you who are our WGBH insiders. Those of you who have joined us tonight, I want to personally say thank you. It is your annual support that makes so much of our programming possible, and particularly these kinds of unique events that we're able to pull together in a venue that we're so lucky to have here at WGBH. Also, if you have questions, you should have gotten one of these cards that you can fill out, and periodically, if you have one that you filled out, to raise your hand, and we have ushers on both sides who will come around and collect them, and then they will be handed to our moderator at the appropriate time, and that will be what we use to involve the audience tonight. Please, if you can write legibly, that would be a big help. I know Beth would particularly appreciate that. You can also join us on Twitter. The handle is at Boston Talks. And then following the program tonight, we hope you'll stay for our little reception out front and a chance to speak one-on-one with our panelists. So now I want to introduce my friend and partner, and also a well-known name and a face in the reporting world, Joe Bergantino, who is the executive director, the managing editor, and the co-founder of the New England Center for Investigative Reporting. So, Joe.
Thank you and welcome. The New England Center for Investigative Reporting exists to hold the powerful accountable. We are a nonprofit news outlet with a dual mission to do serious, in-depth investigative journalism and to train the next generation of investigative reporters. And when we launched in 2009, we envisioned events like this that would start with an in-depth, compelling investigative story, lead to a conversation that continues, that eventually leads to change that's needed. And tonight you have a moderator here who is really an expert on the topic that you'll be talking about. Beth Daley came to us 2 years ago from the Boston Globe, where she'd been a reporter for 20 years, where she covered health, science, the environment, and education. Over the past 2 years, and especially over the past year, she has focused on genetic testing and laboratory-developed tests. She's won 2 major awards for her reporting over the past 6 months, really. Before that, at the Boston Globe, she was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. To learn more about the New England Center, we have a table outside in the lobby. So when you're done here, take a look at our brochures and think about signing up for our email blast, which will give you updates on the work we're doing, which you also will read on occasion, on many occasions in the Boston Globe and here on WGBH Radio. We are very proud to be partners with WGBH, which really is the national public broadcasting powerhouse. Not only is it a major force of news in the Boston area, it's a major force of public broadcasting in the entire country, and we are so proud to be a partner with WGBH. And it was one of the first places we came to in the fall of 2007 when we thought about starting the New England Center. So we are grateful for you to be here tonight. We're grateful to be here tonight, and we thank you so much. And I'd like to introduce Beth Daley, your moderator tonight, and she will introduce your very distinguished panel. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks so much for joining us tonight. I want to actually start off with a question. If someone could assure that it would be completely private, no one else would see it, how many of you would get your entire genome sequence that would predict some future potential for disease? Great, we're gonna ask that question again a little bit later, see where you'll wind up before the end. So I became interested in genetic testing, not through any personal effort to get my genome tested, but through a story I did for the Boston Globe about Lyme disease. And there was a test out there for Lyme disease that a lab had said, look, we will tell you if you have Lyme disease, send your blood to us. And it became very clear that that test was, for anyone really analyzing it, any scientist, was not valid at all. The company was allowed to sell the test without any proving to anyone the test actually worked, which was stunning to me. And that has sort of led me here almost 2 years later to keep writing about genetic testing, not only through that one lens, but as one of the most powerful medical advances of our time. So I want to start, before I bring up the panelists, with a short clip I did of a story about something called non-invasive prenatal testing. So when you're pregnant now, just at 8 weeks, you can get a blood test that will tell you the risk your child will have of Down syndrome or a whole host of other far more serious diseases. And I want to show you the impact these testings have on a real person. So why don't we show that, then I'll introduce our guest.
This new test, brand new test, 99% accurate at 10 weeks, and you can find out the gender. And I thought it was just Down syndrome. I didn't know about the others. And I was here working, and they called with the results. And the minute she answered, it was the doctor, not the nurse, not the midwife. So that right there, I was like, And then she said, where are you? And I just knew it was bad news, because they never ask you where you are if they're giving you good news. And then she said the baby tested positive for T18, trisomy 18. Just, the mortality rate is high, and even if most of them are stillborn, and then if they do survive, it's not more than a few days, even hours, and they can't breathe. They suffer to get breath. And I just was like hysterical, totally hysterical. And then I called him. He was hysterical in the airport. You were crying your eyes out. Because before I got off the phone, I said, "Can tell me the gender?" And she told me it was a boy. And he wanted a boy so bad. And I just remember you crying, saying, "It's a boy, it's a boy." And then I read a story about one woman who didn't want to terminate and went through and gave birth, and then she said, "I wish I never did that because the baby suffered so badly." So when we talked about that, we're like, we don't want to put baby through that, And then she said, it's such a new test. There could have been an error in the lab. That's what I remember her saying. She's like, let's just wait So when I say I have mixed emotions, I'm thrilled. Of course, she's our hero because she convinced us to wait. But yet, knowing now what I know about the test, had they explained the test a little bit beforehand, we wouldn't have to been so traumatized. Didn't have to be like that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That's the part that it's like I have a love-hate for the doctor, to be honest with you. He almost didn't make it.
For other people that are going potentially through the same experience, my heart goes out to those people, because if they're not getting educated and they're not being warned and they don't know the ins and outs of it, they could make a poor decision, just like we almost did. At times, you reflect on it and go, wow, this couldn't have happened. This may have not have happened if we didn't,
And I still
Wait.
can't believe he's here sometimes.
You see this precious little boy who's so happy all the time, and to think, that you could have not made it happen is just, it's sickening. I love you, buddy.
So that's just one example of what can happen. More recently, I've written about psychiatric mental health tests and some promises that people have problems with. But let's get the conversation started. Let's bring up our panelist. Dr. Bruce Cohen, please come up. He's a Robertson-Steele professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and professor emeritus at McLean Hospital in Belmont. He's also the director of the program for neuropsychiatric research. And Dr. Robert Green, for some reason this is not. Dr. Green is a medical geneticist at Harvard Medical School and Brigham Women's Hospital. He's a leading researcher in translational genomics, which we will talk about tonight. You will learn what it is. And we have Jen Schwab, who's a board-certified genetic counselor at Rhode Island Hospital. She's a teaching associate at Brown Medical School and a consultant for Recombine, which is a testing company. So let's get going. So the first question I want to ask all of you is, give me your 20-second. What is the greatest peril and what's the greatest promise of the genetic world we're living in now? Yeah, why don't we start with you?
Greatest
Green.
peril, I think, is that genetics will turn into a sort of pseudoscientific industry, the way that nutraceuticals and health foods and vitamins have turned into today. The greatest promise, of course, is that by integrating genomics appropriately with every facet of our healthcare, we'll discover new medications and vastly improve the health of our entire population.
I think one thing from the clinical side, one of the perils I think is the misunderstanding of genetics and just the general population. I think that clip that you showed is a perfect example of, well, we have these tests available, but really what are these tests telling us and what do the results mean? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we're facing right now. I think as far as the promise, I have to echo you, Dr. Green, that I think hopefully this information really will be powerful enough to help people learn what they can do to improve their health and improve their outcomes based on their genetic background.
Great.
Just to slightly rephrase the great promise, but I think we're all in agreement. The greatest promise is probably that we will learn enough about our complex selves to understand risk and be able to prevent disorders before they impact us. And the peril, as we're saying, is, and it also deals with the complexity of the subject matter, this is hard to understand, even for well-trained people. And the risk of poor quality testing or misinformation, which could lead to bad life decisions, is quite great.
Right, great. Okay, I'm going to ask everyone a question again. Who knows what DTC is? Who knows? Who can explain your DNA and how it's used in genetic testing? Right. So to start, we want to start off in a very basic place. We're going to ask Dr. Green to give us a quick intro into this scientific world we'll be discussing.
Well, first, thanks for being here, all of you, and thank you for having me. And it sounds like a lot of you actually have a good base of knowledge, so bear with me while I just try to bring everybody up to the same speed. There are a couple of terms I think we should all sort of bear in mind. So DNA is the long string of molecules in every cell of your body that has the kind of blueprint for your body to make the proteins and machinery that make you who you are. And it involves all our traits, and whether we're short or tall, and also what diseases we have. And we're actually all about 98 or 99% exactly alike, but we have some changes, and we each call those changes variants. The old terms for them were mutations if that variant was thought to be a bad thing, and polymorphisms if that variant was thought to be a good thing. So you'll hear us toss around the terms variants, or you might hear us say mutations and polymorphisms. And then I just want to make sure you understand the difference between the kinds of testing that's out there right now. So the easiest to understand is probably the newest one, which is sequencing, which means you can actually read every letter of that DNA alphabet. And that's very cool. And the first one cost $3 billion. And right now it's costing about $1,000. And, but you'll also hear us talk about DTC, or direct-to-consumer testing. And right now, DTC testing doesn't use sequencing, though they're all going in that direction. It uses a different technique called genotyping, which is only $100 and gives you little markers along the DNA molecule. It doesn't sequence everything. It gets most of the things we know about, but won't really tell you about the things we don't know about. So in a nutshell, that hopefully brings us up to speed.
Everyone get it? That's a good place to start. So I'm going to start with Bruce, actually, because I recently wrote a story about psychiatric genetic tests can actually tell you, or purport to tell you, what drugs you should use. Your doctor would take a cheek swab. You would get back a result that would say, this depression drug is good for you, this drug is not. But it turned out the promise seemed greater than the reality. And in that context, I wanted to ask you, what are the biggest ethical concerns about these types of tests? And you can speak more broadly about genetic tests, or you can speak about psychiatric tests.
Well, sure. I mean, the ethical issue in this, and on which I'm sure we all agree, is providing good information to people so they can make good decisions. And you're all familiar with the computer terminology, garbage in, garbage out. If the test is not accurate and it does not have predictive power, then you're being misguided. So, and you can make very bad decisions. We saw that in your beautiful and emotionally wrought piece for me. I mean, having kids, we all worry about these things. So going back a step, and you and I dealt with this in the article you did, genes don't code for diseases, and genes don't code for drug metabolism or anything as high level as that in a human being. Genes code for proteins, which are elements that you use to make your cells, which then make up your body. But the levels are very important, and the interactions are important and not easy to understand. And genes, even as it's an antiquated term, but as we understand them, coding for proteins, are only about 1% of what you inherit. Most of the genome, so-called, that can now be sequenced is not even understood. So the ethical issue is, can you take the huge amount of information in DNA molecules, and each of us has the equivalent of several Encyclopedias Britannica just in there in the genes. Can you take that information and boil it down to useful information for people?
Right. Everyone agree that that's pretty the big? Mm-hmm. And how does it work? How are people boiling it down, Jen?
So I think also it's important, to talk about what testing we're actually doing. So for me as a genetic counselor, I'm talking to patients about clinically actionable tests. So what that means is genetic information that actually will either make a diagnosis or give you a prediction of what's going to happen, whether at your risk for cancer or other health concerns. So I sort of break down the types of genetic tests into a couple different categories. One being diagnostic, meaning we have somebody in front of us who has some features and we're trying to either confirm that diagnosis or rule out a diagnosis. There's also screening, which is similar to the test that was discussed in the clip. Screening is really just putting you sort of in a risk category of, are you at higher risk or are you at lower risk? A screen is sort of hoping to catch the majority of people that are going to be affected with a certain condition, but isn't going to get everybody. That way, it's not perfect. Having a positive screen Well, and we really shouldn't use the word positive.
But if you get a positive screen, what happens next?
Positive screen. So you've been put into this risk category, but now we need to confirm it. Now we need to do a diagnostic test to say yes or no, because there are going to be some people that are going to be in that screening category that will come back screen positive that actually don't have the condition that we were looking for.
Right. So I'm going to get provocative for a second. Dr. Green, 2 companies pledged to test for the sport gene to tell if your child will be a soccer, so-so, or a world-class putter, right? There's already these NIPT tests in the marketplace for prenatal. There's lots of talk out there of looking more closely to select, there's a suicide gene test promise. Where's the line on what traits that you can actually test for and which are not?
Well, this is a phenomenon I might call distortion by extrapolation. And what I mean by that is there is a nugget of truth at the base of this. If you take 10,000 people who are sprinters and 10,000 people who are long-distance runners, as I assume somebody has, and you do the genetics test on them, you might find a variant, a change in DNA, that actually is statistically more predictive of one or the other. And that might be absolutely scientifically true. But it is not true that you can turn around, test for that in the individual in front of you, and say anything meaningful about that person. And there's a lot of examples of that are getting promulgated.
But let's take a step back. Like, why is that? I mean, is it because there's so many other influencing factors, or what is it?
It's because these are very modest effect sizes, so they may nudge you in one direction, and if you take a whole lot of people, you can see that difference. But if you are on any 10 people, any 200 people, it would be meaningless. So an example might be if somebody in the audience has a cholesterol of 300, that's an extreme. And if they have a cholesterol of 60, that's another extreme. And we can say something about them as individuals. But if 2 of you are sitting side by side and one of you has a cholesterol of 144, the other one has a cholesterol of 145, we really can't tell you much apart.
Right.
You'd have to have 10,000 people with 140 and 150 to see a difference.
Bruce?
Yeah, no, I want to both agree with that, and I complimented Robert before we all got into the room about the research he's doing. As a simple example, because it's very much on my plate, if you do risk genes for, say, schizophrenia, what you find out is it's estimated now there are 8,000 genes that contribute to the risk. Now, schizophrenia, the inherited component of that is 80%. Your genes determine 80% of your risk. And so you would think that you'd be able to do a genetic screen and say, oh, you're at risk or you're not at risk. But you can't easily deal with those 8,000 genes. Some things are simpler, where most of the conditions that Jen's going to be able to give people advice on are single gene disorders, where you could say, well, if you inherit this variant of this gene, you're at a substantially elevated risk or at a substantially decreased risk. Robert actually is one of the few people who's going around trying to connect the dots, which is how do you take all that complex genomic information and do the quality aspect of communicating that to people in a realistic way so they understand it. And Jen's got the very difficult task of taking the field the way it is before Robert can do all of that work and dealing with that interpretation on a day-to-day basis of, so how do you take this incomplete information that we get and make a decision based on that?
Right. Well, I want to talk about Robert's project right now, but I'm also curious, so what tests are good, which ones aren't? Like, I think a lot of people, I want to know, like, which ones are solid and which ones aren't. Jen, do you want to take a stab at that?
I think at this point, it's going to be the more diagnostic tests, the ones where the gene is known to cause a certain feature or a certain condition or a certain risk. For example, BRCA, we've heard about those in the news. They're associated with hereditary breast and ovarian cancer. So if a woman is diagnosed with a BRCA mutation, we know that we need to screen her much more closely than somebody in the general population. Things like, sometimes the direct-to-consumer tests, which I know we'll talk about, kind of give you interesting information about certain traits, like how sticky your earwax is. Well, I guess that's helpful, but I could probably just tell you that based on, my own experience. So what we're really doing in the clinic is diagnostic and clinically actionable. So something that's actually going to change medical management rather than just giving interesting information.
But how do you tell as a consumer, which we all are here? I got an email today from someone who said they have a genetic test to diagnose irritable bowel syndrome, which is just sort of this diagnosed by exclusion for the most part. how do I know to use that one or versus another one? What's advice you can give? And I'll let maybe Jen start, and I'd love Robert to chime in.
Yeah, I think knowing what the data is, knowing what lab is doing it, is the lab CLIA approved. So we often talk about the FDA, which I know we'll go into, but CLIA is the governing body that makes sure that labs are doing quality assurance, making sure that they're actually testing for the right thing, doing the right process, having the right quality, controls. So I think that's a big piece of it. And how accurate is that data? How strong is the correlation between this genetic finding and whatever you're wondering about? And really knowing as just the general population, it's really hard. And even we sometimes in clinic have to wonder, is this the right lab? Is this the right test? Is this the best option? And that's why it's important to ask the questions. And obviously I'm a little bit biased, but seeing a genetic counselor, seeing a genetic professional is really going to help sort of navigate that.
Robert, do you want to?
Well, I think we're in the midst of a giant revolution, a disintermediation of experts and people in every walk of life, not just medicine. You can do things now on the internet, you can learn things on your own that you previously needed an expert to do. And some people are more comfortable seeking out that sort of thing and trying it out on their own and feeling empowered by that, and other people are more comfortable using an expert. And in this case, in this use case, if you will, there are people who really want to get their medical care and their genetics care through a professional, through a genetic counselor, a geneticist, their family physician, whatever. But along with the rest of society in genetics, there are people who firmly believe that you should be able to get your own genetic information, not just part of it, but all of it, warts and all. If you wish to, you should be able to explore it. You should be able to send it to your friends. You should be able to post it on the internet. You should be able to use any genetics company that wants to offer you interpretation, sort of buyer beware. So you've got a huge range of opportunities here for people to explore genetic information, and people are willing to fill the market on the direct-to-consumer end. I just wish to add, I actually believe it's a good thing. I think it's a great thing as long as what you're getting is represented accurately. As long as we tell you that we're going to give you information with modest effect sizes, may not be medically proven to benefit you, but if you know what you're getting, I think it's great, because those people who want to seek it out, that's what they want.
Well, I think we're going to go into DTC right now, because I think we've opened the door. We'll come back to these other questions, but has everyone heard of 23andMe? So 23andMe was offering tests in the US, and in 2013, the FDA sent them a letter saying, you're not allowed to do that, basically. You're not allowed. They're recently back, and they've gotten some FDA approval for Bloom syndrome, I think, right? And maybe a few others down the road. But they're still not allowed to sell directly to consumers. And that's, anyone want to talk about why? I think
I'm willing to.
It's a very controversial issue, I should say.
I think all of it, well, it is controversial, and I think that can't necessarily reach a final consensus based on what we know. I mostly agree with Robert, but not completely. The reason being that genetic information is so hard to understand that I think even experts often don't understand it. I have a PhD in genetics, and I do genetic research, and I don't fully understand the data that we get on the people we're studying. So I think that Robert is correct ethically, that if somebody wants to go and get genetic information on themselves, maybe that's okay. But I'm not sure they completely understand. I don't think they'll completely understand what they're getting. I would advise them, don't do it that way. With 23andMe, as Jen was saying, I mean, do you know, have they been laboratory tested? Are all the results for sure? What's the predictive power of the results they're giving you? There are lots of sophisticated questions. And as I said before, how closely are these genes in any event connected to a risk assessment and a final decision? Plus, and we were talking about this a little bit ahead of time too, once you give that genetic information to the internet, it's out there. You can't take it back. If you give it to these companies, do you know for sure that it won't be hacked or it won't be released? It was said in an article in Scientific American that Google made the same promise quite some time ago, that all of the private information you give them will not go beyond Google, and then 10 years later it was all going beyond Google. 23andMe is in the business of selling you a product. They're not in the business of providing medical care. And genetic information is extremely seductive. We all want a clear answer to complex questions. Sometimes the answer isn't there. The information that we get is very reductive. It may be inaccurate, and it could lead you in a bad direction.
Well, Jen, I think you have strong opinions on this.
Yeah, well, I think also I totally agree that we all have the right to know about our genetic information, explore it, share with our friends, everything that you said. But I think it also depends on the purpose. If you're just doing it for curiosity, awesome. Be curious. Find out where your ancestry is from. You know, go through all of that. But if you're doing it to change your medical management, I'm wary about using a direct-to-consumer company, because we just don't know enough, and there's not enough regulation to know if the information they're actually providing you is something you should base.
I haven't seen any studies, and I'm sure they exist. Do people make significant medical decisions based on these decisions?
Well, we've actually conducted an NIH-funded study on exactly that question, in which we recruited 2,000 customers of 2 companies, one of them was 23andMe, and asked whether they were making medical decisions. For example, the FDA, when they shut down 23andMe's health component in November 2013, cited that they were afraid people would change their medication based on the pharmacogenomic information, because they give you a list of drugs that...
You have to stop. Explain pharmacogenetics.
They give you a list of drugs that you might metabolize more quickly or more slowly, and encourage you to take that to your doctor. And they were afraid people would just stop taking their own meds. When we queried that, less than 1% of people changed their prescription-based medications based on their DTC report. So it was a reasonable fear. The data don't support that people are abusing it.
In that study, did they go into the motivation for why people did 23andMe?
People are curious, and they want to be empowered about their own health. Now, we don't disagree entirely, though we come at this from slightly different areas. There is a powerful narrative that says that genomics predicts disease and genomic information can change your health, that is so powerful and so pervasive in our society. And it is more complex than that. I totally agree with you. But I think the other side of that is that direct-to-consumer genetics companies and the industry visionaries who feel that they can be empowered with genomics have pushed us forward much faster than we would have gone on our own.
Well, who first sequenced the human genome?
Well, that's right. NIH was plugging along, and this maverick came along and started a company to do it for profit.
Yeah, and you know, it's not against the companies. I think that's very important. But if you deal with a commercial enterprise, you have to realize you're dealing with a commercial enterprise. And I think Jen's question also was right on the mark. What are you expecting? Why are you sending your DNA to 23andMe? What do you want back? I would cite 2 things, though, really quickly. One is medical and the other is not medical. One, which is the medical, we get a lot of this stuff on genomic testing for metabolism of drugs. Do my genes say that I should take this drug or not? And I know plenty of physicians who use that. I'm skeptical of it, even for a physician, because what is the biggest determinant of metabolism is not your genetics, it's the other drugs you're taking. So what you sometimes see is that people spend so much time worrying about the genetics, they miss the rest of the human story. And I know no one on stage, and certainly not Robert, because he's done studies on this, and he said so, you know, no one is suggesting you just take the genetic information and use it out of context. The other one is a non-medical story, but it just illustrates the dangers of not being careful. So a family goes and says, well, you know what, we're interested in our ancestry. And the father gets DNA testing, the mother gets DNA testing, and the children get DNA testing. What are they going to find out? They're going to find out and this has been variously estimated as 15 to 25% of the children are going to find out, that's not my father. So, and again, it's just be careful what you seek. You may get more than you bargained for.
Now, that's a smart father. He's not going to go for that test.
Yeah. If he knows, Robert.
Or,
If
smart mother.
Smart mother, yeah. If she knows.
Right.
That's a higher
But we
number than I would
discover
suspect.
this in genetic testing all the time. You know, smart mothers and fathers aside, we see that.
Well, let's go back to because I do want to get to the regulatory aspect of this in a little bit, but I do want to know. So these days, it used to be you can test for one gene and it was very expensive. Now you can test your whole genome basically for incredibly cheap. But what comes back is not always clear. And so what do you do with that information? Anyone I'll let Jen start and we'll take it there.
It's a great question. So we call it the $1,000 genome with $1 million interpretation, because we get all of this information, but there's got to be somebody with the knowledge to go through and say, what's real, what's not, you know, and that's really hard and expensive and takes a lot of resources. When a patient comes in to see me in clinic, you know, there's a number of indications, but what we always talk about, what is the expectation of this test? You know, how good is the test? Okay, you're coming for one particular indication. How much do we know about the genetics of it? Maybe we only know the genes that account for 10% of that condition. Okay, so if we do this test and it comes back negative, well, we haven't ruled it out completely. There's still other things that we could consider. Now we're sort of moving into the world where rather than doing just single genes, we can look at multiple genes at a time. And now we're even at the point where we can do a clinical exome. So you were mentioning that, you know, our DNA, we have 3 billion base pairs, so 3 billion DNA letters. And our exome, the stuff that actually makes the protein, is a very small piece of that. We're able to sequence that now and look through that information, and it's hard to know, well, what's real, what's not. Part of the reason when we offer this test, we look at both parents, again, to sort of compare as like the internal controls to say, all right, well, how are these different changes being inherited? If they're inherited in certain ways, do we think that's more significant than others?
Right, so that makes sense. So just in that, because you're often, so we have, it seems like two sides here, right? We have people who say we want this genetic information to sort of be filtered down through experts who can then explain it to. But there is another thought out there, which I think Robert talks about, which is, and I was going to ask this question of you, but I know your answer already. Do we need genetic counselors? I mean, do we need them? And because
Are you kicking her off the island?
I'm going to let you guys answer first. I'll sit back for a minute.
because there's an argument out there that it's my information. I want to know it. I will seek out the information, and it's one extreme, but I know that's out there.
Well, it's like saying, do we need NBC? I mean, we used to have just 3 channels, and now we have myriad ways of getting our broadcast information. Of course, we need genetic counselors, and we need specialists, and we need doctors of all ilk. But what we're moving to is a world where some people are going to want to get their information through a genetic counselor, and others are not. Some people want to go to their primary care physician. Some people are going to want to do it on their own. And just like in social media, just like in cable television, there's just going to be multiple channels of information that people have to choose from. Yeah. I think as communicators, we need to suggest to you that some of those channels are wiser than others. Yeah. Some of those channels are very unwise, but people are going to be free to make their choices.
And I agree with that. I don't think we're on opposite sides of anything, by the way. I just think we're a little bit different place on a spectrum of how free you want to be with this and how much you want to regulate it or get people extra information. If it were my advice to someone, I would say genomic information is so complex, go work with an expert. And I just think that's good advice, and I don't actually hear Robert saying anything different anyway about that. As for somebody's right to the genomic information, I don't think I would disagree with that either. What I might say instead is that there's a background to all of this, which is the same as how we make decisions about what should be regulated and to what extent it should be regulated and by whom. So you want to know that the food in your supermarket is relatively safe. You want to know the drugs you take have been proven to be effective and not have terrible side effects, and on with the things we regulate. Now, I don't think you have to regulate genetic testing at the same level that you regulate drugs. On the other hand, wouldn't it be nice to know that somebody offering a genetic test has had some kind of vetting, that the procedures they're using are accurate, and that the information that they're sharing is correct?
Right, so let me just take a pause and explain. So most genetic tests out there today are called laboratory-developed tests, and it's a big controversy in Washington right now. The tests are allowed to be sold using some federal regulation like CLIA, which makes sure there's very good laboratory practices. But what it doesn't do is actually have a pair of independent eyes on the test and to make sure it's both accurate and safe. And there's a big controversy about that right now. The FDA has announced they're going to regulate it, and there's a lot of pushback. So I just want to give the context, but everyone has, people tend to have very strong opinions because on one side, we're going to hear it, it needs to be regulated, and the other side it doesn't. So Jen, do you want to go, and then Robert?
There's sort of two different, I think, pieces to this genetic testing. So there's the genomic testing, looking at everything, trying to get information out of curiosity, out of interest. Then there's the diagnostic piece, which is obviously what I'm more a part of as a clinical genetic counselor. There have been a number of studies that have shown the benefit of having a genetics professional involved in ordering genetic testing. We're talking about the rising cost of healthcare. Well, part of our role as genetics professionals is to do a good family history assessment, to gather information. During an assessment, we might find out, hey, my patient is actually not the most informative family member. It would be better to test this person instead. Based on their information, then we can give a better answer for our patient now. That's going to reduce cost, because if we test the affected or the most informative family member, we're more likely to find the answer. If we find a specific answer for a family, it's a much cheaper test. Rather than looking at 25 genes, we can just target it on one single spot. Okay, if you think about reading our genes like books, we're going on this expedition. We're reading the entire Encyclopedia Britannica. For this patient, we just have to turn to page 12 and say, is that mutation there, is it not?
But every time there's a panel developed that adds some tests, doctors actually order the panel more. And when there's exomes and genomes that are inexpensive, and they'll probably go down to $100 or less, perhaps even be given away as free, everybody will have access to their whole genome for no cost whatsoever except the interpretive costs. Now you heard, I'm going to disagree with Jen on a couple of points. You heard the adage about $1,000 genome, $1 million interpretation. Well, the actual truth is right now in a CLIA-approved laboratory with a very rigorous interpretation, you can get this. Anybody in this audience can come to our offices and we'll order that. We can get it for $2,900. That's the entire whole genome sequence, every base pair, and a careful medical interpretation which will look for every disease-associated mutation that you might have. $2,900 today. So we're really almost there. Secondly, I think our window here, I think everything she's saying is exactly right. That's how I was trained. But I think our window here is really unnecessarily narrow. I think within a few years, it will be malpractice not to have your sequence with you and for us to look at every disease-associated gene in it. And thirdly, I would just point out that this is all of medicine. This isn't just genomics. When you walk into the emergency room with chest pain, or your doctor is making a probabilistic assessment of whether you might have an MI or not. When you get back a low blood sugar, they're making a probabilistic assessment contextualized by other things about whether you have diabetes. We're the only subsection of medicine that's afraid of its own technology. When you get back your genome, we will train ourselves to contextualize this information, communicate it probabilistically, contrary to that deterministic narrative that we've all been inculcated with. And then I think genomics will truly be integrated with the practice of medicine.
Yeah,
I have to disagress with you a little bit on just one point, unless you have something.
No, I want to, and I Bruce is next, then you can go disagree.
Well, I don't care about the order, but
Well, go ahead. Oh, that's something. Go ahead, Jen. Go.
Jen. So I agree that I think in the future we're all going to be walking around with our genome information on a flash drive that we're going to have on our keychain. We're not there yet. And right now, I think that the value of our role as genetic professionals is to make sure that patients understand what this test is going to tell us. So a whole exome, for example, I always explain to patients that doing a whole exome today, a negative result would be a snapshot in time. Okay, it's just a negative result based on our knowledge today in 2015. I have 3 patients that I offered exomes for in 2013 that since their negative results, we now have different tests that are available for them.
Right.
Because at the time in 2013, there were genes that we didn't even know to look for. And now that we've gotten a little bit smarter, 2 years have gone by, we're understanding a little bit more, now we can actually offer an even better test. Right. So a negative doesn't mean you're off the hook. It doesn't mean you're not at risk. It doesn't mean what you're dealing with isn't genetic, just means we're not smart enough to find it.
Right.
Well, it only partly means that. I agree with you, but I don't think Robert, I think Robert would agree that you have your genome, but you can only interpret part of it. I think we'd probably all be in agreement on that. Returning to the point again, your exome is a very small amount of what you inherit. There's much more in the DNA than is measured by exomes. And even if you sequence the entirety of it, we still don't know exactly what to do with the sequence. You were going to ask a question about the future, and Robert already introduced it. So for reasons, because I've gotten old, people ask me to do
Before you go, I'm going to stop you for 1 second before you go to the future. If you have questions, please ask, because we're going to turn to that very shortly.
Because Robert went to the future, and I think that there's some truth to what he said, but I'd be cautious again that I've been asked in recent years to do the future of drug treatment, the future of psychiatry, and even the future of all of medicine. And one of the slides I like to lead with is what I call "Where's my flying car?" That when I was growing up, and many of you may not be old enough to remember this, I was promised by Popular Mechanics that by the year 2000 I would be driving a flying car. And it makes sense from a technical standpoint that we could produce flying cars, but there are reasons that we don't and why they're impractical. One of the things we've learned about biology in general and genetics in particular is it's a whole lot more complex than we think, and it's going to go a lot slower than we predict. It will go at a different rate in different directions with different information than we know now. The advantage of having a whole genome will be true someday. I don't personally think it'll be true in the very immediate future. I think most of the information in there, I don't think in 10 years. I've seen that before, where people think it's going to be in the next 10 years. But the many things we've been promised in the next 10 years generally don't pan out. And I think the genome is so complex, and there's so many levels of interpretation. I would add one more that we didn't mention, two more. One is that every cell in your body is not the same, and they do not have the same DNA. Every cell in the body is actually a little bit different and has different DNA. And especially when you talk about things like cancer, you need to sample the tumor in many cases, not some other cell in the body, because the tumor is different. Secondly, an awful lot of risk is not determined by the gene you inherited. It's determined by a gene as modified by what's called epigenomic effects. Genes turn on and off during life. They produce more protein, they produce less protein. And the regulation, in my own field, in psychiatry, it's now estimated that most of the story is in gene regulation, turning them on and off, not in the absolute content of the gene. But a lot of the turning on and off is determined by chemical markers, some of which you inherit but are not measured by these sequencings, and some of which are put on the DNA by life events, drugs, infections. Some of the things that infect you actually insert themselves into your DNA and change it during life. So it just isn't going to be as simple as getting a DNA sequence and getting easy interpretation. For some things, as Jen said, yes. For other things, a lot of things, I'd say most things, not for some time to come.
So I just want to jump to, because we're going to run out of time fairly soon and want to ask audience questions. So one thing I've written a lot about that I'm going to ask is about this sort of conflict of interest, this sort of closed loop system that I see in a lot of these genetic tests, which is because they're not regulated by the FDA, take that yes or no, I'm not sure what the answer is. What happens is most of the data that comes out is from the company. So lots of research shows that the data can be biased in those cases. They get published, peer-reviewed occasionally, but then what happens, salespeople then go educate the doctors who do not understand genetics. The reason why this woman almost aborted her child was because the doctor told her it was 99% accurate. Not true. And then it comes back down, around again, is that it's sort of this loop system. It's all the company is sort of selling to the doctors. Doctors are using it. They want something new and better than the next doctor, at least I'm seeing, and then the patient uses it. And so it's like, where is the insert, should that be regulated, or not even regulated, how do you handle that? Because I can't think of another thing like it.
It's not easy. We have a lot of, just in our practice, there are many different providers that are ordering genetic testing, and that's not a bad thing. But I think that there is this bias of, well, what salesperson is knocking on my door the most often? What salesperson is telling me their test is the best versus someone else? Or, well, this panel has 180 genes and this one has 175, so I'm going to go with the bigger panel. But that's not always the best choice. And I think that it's it's really the responsibility of the ordering provider to know their limitations. It's okay to not understand everything. You know, I feel like I say that to people all the time, like, I don't know, but I don't know if anyone knows. Let's, you know, work on that together. But there are some labs that I choose over others because I know that their interpretation is stronger, their data is more sound than others, but I think that comes with training and with experience. I don't know if there's a good answer for that.
Yeah, I think professional organizations are going to play a role as they catch up and they give guidance to doctors. But remember, this is not an issue that's singular to genetics.
No.
You know, every medical device manufacturer has sales reps out there. Every pharmaceutical company has sales reps out there. And doctors, like everybody else, are subject to market forces and conflicts of interest and so forth. But just since you started down the FDA is well-meaning in this regard, but they have given themselves a very hard task because they have decided they want to regulate not only on the basis of analytic validity, like whether the machine gives you what it's supposed to give you, that I'm fine with. But they've decided they want to regulate on the basis of clinical utility, like is it useful clinically? And they don't know it, and we don't know it, and they're doing a major disservice to innovation because right now that posture is dampening innovation throughout the world of commercial and academic genomics. It's a terrible thing for progress.
Did you want to add, Bruce? Or you?
Well, no, I largely agree with that. I think we've seen the same thing in drugs, and that there's some lessons there, which is, of course, the FDA is an impossible bind. If the drugs don't come out fast enough, they're yelled at. If the drugs come out too fast and there's a problem, they're yelled at. So the answer is in the middle, and as everybody has already said, the answer is going to be imperfect. If you've got to have input from consumers, the doctors, the companies, the government, the insurers, and you do the best you can with the advice you get. And I know it's one more committee, but it's the way society works. You have to get all that, and you make your best choice. I would say the answer, again, is someplace in the realm of moderation, which is the government probably should be requiring that any company offering these tests satisfy certain accuracy, laboratory accuracy tests for their product. And I would think that they probably should be required to have some review of how they share the information so that it's interpretable, that they're not making false claims. If you watch the television at night, and those of us, again, who are a little bit older are always being besieged by drug ads, and my wife, Marion, who's sitting in the front row, will tell you that I'm groaning all the time and thinking, well, now that's not really quite right, or you really shouldn't say quite that. We want not to have that happen. We want to have people present a good, accurate case. And maybe there is a place for, if not the FDA, somebody to make sure that the test is accurate and the information provided is accurate. Maybe that's all.
It seems, I think most consumers believe that's, when they go get a genetic test, they actually, I've talked to enough of them now, believe they're getting something that's been vetted in some way. And drugs are vetted, medical devices not so much.
Well, the drugs, even the drugs, and I think this is something we need to realize. Who does the drug tests?
Yeah,
Drug companies.
The drug companies do them.
Right.
Yeah.
And who does the device testing? The device companies do them. So, just from a consumer standpoint, if you're interested in having your elected representatives represent you on this, these are issues that need to be thought about. Are we doing this right?
And I don't think it's necessarily the technology. I really think it's the interpretation, because what one lab may call, so a single spelling mistake in your DNA, one lab may call a mutation or a pathogenic variant, something that's disease-causing, where one may say, we just don't have enough information to say that that's true or not. And if that information is not being shared appropriately, then how do we know which is the right answer?
Exactly. And now some of Jen's colleagues, I won't speak for her, would say that's a reason not to give you the information because we're unsure about its interpretation. I would say we are unsure about its interpretation, but that's a reason to give you the information, you and your doctor, and for your doctor to then help you contextualize that risk. So I don't know if that's your position, but that's the difference that a lot of people see. They want to regulate it that you can't have it. I'm saying, of course you should have it, but we should be very clear about the uncertainties associated with it.
Right.
And I don't take that stance. You know, I don't think we should be afraid of the unknown or afraid of an inconclusive result. We all kind of have inconclusive.
But you would
Not everything is black and white, but people need to be aware of what a variant means, of what an uncertain result means, and how we're going to manage you sort of based on that.
So one thing, let me just stop you for it. So I'm going to take the questions from the audience in just right now, and we'll start asking those because I want to get those in for sure. But I would say, I just feel like it's necessary to ask a comment about this, is if you can't see, a lot of these companies are testing your genes, right? And they're grabbing from different pieces of medicine and different parts of genetic information to test to it. But all of that is basically an algorithm that they pop out with a result. It seems to me, in my reporting, unfortunately, you can't see inside that algorithm because it's proprietary, which is, it's as a consumer, I'm kind of like, well, that doesn't seem right. I want someone making sure that just the mechanics of that thing is right. Maybe they're throwing in the kitchen sink there.
Well, no, that's the hand's length argument, and this is complex, and I'm not sure we have the answer, but you could look at it, which is a company that makes a device, for example, does have to share the specifics of the device with the government, but that's not the same thing as saying that the guts of the device are published for everybody to copy.
Right.
And you could do the same thing here, where you could say the company does not have to share the algorithm, but somebody has to look at it and say that algorithm has a high likelihood of producing an accurate result. And I didn't hear Robert and Jen disagree on the point that whether you get it direct from the company or you go through a doctor, what the company shares should be accurate, and it should say if a result is uncertain, that it's uncertain. A lot of genetic results are only probabilistic. In fact, almost all genetic results are probabilistic. So that's what people need help understanding, though. People don't understand probability well.
They don't. I think most people would. Okay, so let's take a question from Beth in Brookline. What are the economics to genetic testing? For example, what is the average cost of a panel for tick disease or prenatal diseases? And how have the number of testing companies increased in the past 5 or 10 years? You want to take there's more to that.
So the cost of genetic testing, I would love to know what lab you're using that does a $2,900 exome, because we have not had that experience. And whole genome let's talk later, because I would love to hear about that. But so with panel testing, they can run a couple $1,000s. Whole exome, our experience has been that they're up to about $10,000. Single gene tests are going to be much cheaper. Insurance is pretty good about covering the testing if you meet certain criteria. So
give us an example, like the BRCA for breast cancer and ovarian cancer. What does that cost? What does the prenatal test cost?
Yep, so BRCA1 and BRCA2, if you do it as a single gene or as a larger panel looking at other high-risk genes associated with hereditary cancer or more moderately risk genes, which have higher risk but not as high as BRCA, that can run you about $4,500. Typically, if somebody meets the criteria, so the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, the NCCN, they put out the guidelines for who meets criteria for testing. So that's based on personal history, behavior of the tumor, the family history. And if somebody meets that criteria, then typically insurance does cover the cost of these tests. That being said, healthcare is always increasing, and now we're seeing a lot of people with very high deductibles, which means that these tests, while they're covered by insurance, they still may have a very high out-of-pocket expense.
But if I may, Jen, I believe you're talking about diagnostic testing for people with cancer and their relatives.
Or pre-symptomatic, somebody with a family history.
But what if I told you in this room that for $100, I could test all your cancer predisposition genes and tell you if you had mutations in them that were putting you at a higher risk for cancer? How many people would want to know? $100. I'm talking about cancer right now. $100, cancer predisposition. Okay. Right now, you can't get an insurance company to pay for that because you are not a family member of somebody with a hereditary cancer. But I think the question is, shouldn't you be able to get that if you want to?
And I would say I don't know. And I would say it for the same reasons, which is the missing word in there was all the genes that have already been shown to be associated with cancer, which are not necessarily even a small proportion of the genes that are associated with cancer. Alzheimer's is another good case. We know plenty of genes that are associated with Alzheimer's disease, but the most common ones do not cause enough of an increase in risk that you would necessarily want to do anything than what you would do otherwise. which is you want the best way to avoid Alzheimer's disease at this moment. Good diet, good exercise, especially brain exercise, and do the healthy things that you already know you should be doing. So I don't disagree, and maybe insurance companies should pay for that, but I'm not sure that the cost benefit of doing that at this particular moment in history is worth it. You'd have to price it out.
I absolutely agree. I think the question of whether the cost benefit is worth it is different than the question of whether people who wish it should be allowed to get
But
it.
that's an insurance question, to make the distinction. That if someone says, I want to get my cancer genes tested, a personal question, I'll pay for it, is a very different question than I want to get my genes tested and society should pay for it.
I agree.
Yeah, and I want to I'll just throw a quick question out there, but what does associated with mean, right? Like, what does that mean? Like, where's the risk in that, or the confidence? And
So when you do genetic testing, what you essentially find is you do it in large groups of people, as I think Robert explained, and you find that certain gene variants are found more commonly in people with a disease than in people without a disease. Why that is true can get very complex. But the word associated pops up just because it doesn't imply anything other than the finding is that you see it more along with the disease.
And if I could add, so, and this is really important, and because if I tell you you've got a 20% risk of heart disease and I'm going to have a gene which can double your risk to 40%, that's pretty significant.
right, right.
But if I tell you you have a 1% risk of multiple sclerosis and there's a gene that can double your risk to 2%,
Right.
that's not very substantial or informative. Right. So a lot of it depends on what your risk was to begin with.
Right.
Here's a question from Chip in Brighton. Do you see a possible genetic monoculture is dangerous in humans, as we know it is in agriculture? Is there a potential danger in trying to eliminate genes seen as related to illnesses when we do not know what advantages these genes may bring, such as sickle cell anemia as a crude example?
Of course, there's a danger. Yes, I think so. But if you know, one of my colleagues at Mass General Hospital is a lovely young woman who discovered she has a definitive mutation for 100% inherited form of prion disease, which will kill her at about age 50. And as she says in her own words, I'm first in line for CRISPR, the technology which may be able to actually break and reheal the gene with taking that out. So I think if you walk in the shoes of the people, even with rare diseases, who are suffering from this, you really do want to explore this technology.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think, again, one has to make a distinction here, which is many of the genes which put you at risk for illness may also have some beneficial effects in some other context. Genes don't almost never work individually. They work in the context of thousands of other genes. And those aren't the genes you would target. But as Robert is saying, to give the other example that's common, Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease happens because a particular gene, a specific single gene, totally determining of the disorder, grows to an enormous size by a repeated section of the base pairs of DNA that go over and over and over and over again. And if you could eliminate that section that's getting repeated over and over and over again, there wouldn't be Huntington's disease. Is there any advantage to that gene growing? As far as we can tell, no. None at all. And it's generally selected against in the population. It's a bad thing.
Fun fact, sickle cell actually does have protective
Yes.
mechanisms, where in areas with malaria, people who are sickle cell carriers have a lower chance of getting that disease, which is interesting. But I also think that, I think Robert mentioned something earlier, that I think the more we learn, the more we realize we hardly knew anything to begin with. We're going to be learning so much about the interactions of these genes, about what a gene's function is, not just when it's broken, but when it's there and doing something good, that I think that's a really good question and one to
Totally agree with that, but completely irrelevant. Because there's some things we know now, and we shouldn't sacrifice those on the altar of expecting to know everything.
Bill from Canton asks, would genetic testing lead to future cloning issues? Do state or federal laws regulate present cloning genetic testing procedures? That they
Well, it's not legal in this country to clone a human being, if that's what you're asking.
Christiane from Brighton, what are your thoughts on the ethics surrounding a person testing for something that may change the way they live their life, i.e. Alzheimer's? Someone may not marry, have children, etc., for fear of an inevitable future and early onset.
See, that's the same mistake again of thinking that your genes are all determining, because they're not. your genes are, may put you at more or less risk, and again, usually in a very complex setting. So if you know you're at higher risk for Alzheimer's disease, you don't necessarily have to fix that by changing your genes. We treat a lot of genetic disorders, by the way. We treat genetic inherited disorders all the time without changing the genes. We just take other measures that protect people. So it isn't an all or none, and fortunately, it isn't as simple as that.
And that example of Alzheimer's disease is something I actually spent 15 years studying. And we used ApoE, which is a gene for higher risk of Alzheimer's disease, not definitive, as a model. And what we found is, in fact, the people who self-select to get that information handle it quite well. And so, you know, in 4 separate randomized clinical trials put on with about 15 million of your tax dollars, thank you very much, we have demonstrated that that exact example, which has been pulled out over and over and over again as a fear, does not come to pass. And in over 700,000 people tested for ApoE in an open-label trial, probably the largest genetic open-label trial in humanity, 23andMe has not had, to my knowledge, a single incident where somebody has come back and said, you ruined my life, I jumped off of a roof. And 1/4 of those people learned they were E4 positive, that they had the high risk. So we got to think about evidence. There are these ethical concerns, but then we do evidence to determine whether they are substantial or not.
But Robert, just to be, again, my position would be down a notch. I don't disagree with you, but a lot of studies of people's interpretation of medical tests, and a genetic test is just a medical test. We do all kinds of tests on people already that tell them their risks for all kinds of things, and we do that with confidence, and I think that's perfectly all right. But surveys, a bunch of surveys, some of them done by NIH, showed that people's ability to interpret those tests is really lousy, that the literacy we have for interpreting even the simple medical tests is bad. And for the genetic testing, it's going to be harder. But this is one of the reasons I like Robert's research on that portion of it, because we need to learn how to communicate the information better, and that has to be a piece of it. So access is fine, but what has to go with access, another piece is accurate explanation.
Absolutely.
So we're going to have to be wrapping up soon, so I want to ask a couple of more questions, but we're going to keep the answers. I'm going to do the buzzer.
Good answer.
So Alexis from Marblehead asked, what are the mechanics of a false positive, like the video clip showed? Can anyone take up what a false positive is versus maybe when it uses, go for it.
Yeah, so a false positive, I think it also depends on what test we're looking at. So for this NIPT test, which actually they're changing it to NIPS, or non-invasive prenatal screening, because it's not a test, it's a screen. So this gets a little bit complicated, but what they're actually doing with that particular test is looking at mom's blood, which has cell-free fetal DNA, so DNA that's representative of the pregnancy. And I say pregnancy specifically, not the fetus, because the DNA is actually from the placenta, it's not from the fetus. So while the placenta and the fetus are very similar, sometimes there are going to be changes in the placenta that aren't in the fetus, so not in the baby, that are going to be what's identified through that test. So that can explain some of the false positives, and also just the data interpretation and the methods that they're using may sort of skew the data.
Right, that's great.
I know there are prenatal counselors in the room that could probably answer that a little bit more detailed if you're interested.
Yes. And this is from Sarah in Lexington. I'm not sure. Well, if a woman uses an egg donor, what, if any, genetic impression does the birth mother have on the baby? Is that?
Some.
Wait, the birth mother or the birth father?
The birth mother.
Birth mother.
Yeah.
Yeah, complicated question, but the birth mother would have some.
Because
Well,
the
well,
environment and the genes, the environment of the pregnancy is going to be based on the birth mother.
Right. I mean, sometimes we underestimate environmental effects, and again, most disorders are only partly genetic. So there's that. By the way, the donated egg has an effect on the mother too, who carries.
That's interesting. In what way?
You actually end up carrying cells from the children from your pregnancy, and you can find them throughout the body, including in the brain.
Right. So Melissa from Cambridge asks, if health insurance uses family history as criteria for genetic testing, what happens if a person is adopted and has no known family history?
We use that as criteria. If we don't know the family history, it's an unknown, and that has to be factored in. So, that's something that we can usually explain away pretty easily.
And let's just ask a sort of related question. How much of this information is being used by insurance information to deny or for coverage?
So in 2008, there was a law that was passed called the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And this law actually protects you against health insurance discrimination and employment discrimination. So basically what that means is if you're found to have a genetic predisposition to any condition, your health insurance can't change your premiums, they can't drop you. If you're changing your health insurance, they can't choose to carry you or not. When it comes to employment, if you work for a company that has larger than 15 employees, then your employer cannot use this information to promote you, fire you, change your position. That being said, health insurance, it's actually sometimes a benefit where if you're found to have certain genetic changes that mean that you should be having certain screening, that sort of means your insurance should cover that. Where GINA does not cover is life insurance and long-term care insurance. So if you're found to have a genetic predisposition and the next day you go out to buy a life insurance policy, they can use that information to choose not to cover you.
But they don't. They currently, most major life insurance companies know that it would be very bad optics to do that, so they typically do not.
But it is true that people do things behind the scenes, because there always are rules, and then there are what people actually do. There are lots of laws in this country about what insurance companies can and cannot do, and they break them.
Regularly. So we have a lot more questions, and I'm sorry we can't get to them all, but it is 8:15. We want to get you all out and talking with our panelists and among yourselves. I'll ask just a quick wrap up really quick for everyone, and Robert, why don't you start?
Okay. Well, thanks for the opportunity to do here. As you can see, it's a diverse and exciting arena. We have a program at Brigham Women's Hospital that I invite you to look at genomes2people.org. And if you yourself strongly wish to be sequenced as a healthy individual, there are very few places in the world that you can get that done, but you can come see us, and we will counsel you first, and we will consider doing that for you.
Can you just explain what you're doing just really quickly?
We are exploring what it means to sequence healthy individuals in some of our projects. One of our projects is called the MedSeq Project in adults. Another one is the BabySeq Project in newborns, and in both of those, we're sequencing ostensibly healthy individuals and giving them back all the information that's in their genome, and carefully following them with a safety net to determine what they do with it, what their doctors do with it, what it costs to them in society, what it might benefit them. And so you can come and be sequenced as part of one of those studies, or you can come and be sequenced as a regular patient. Where's that again? Brigham and Women's Hospital, last name Green.
Jen, do you want to?
Without an E.
Last takeaway, what's the takeaway?
I would just say that if you have a person,
Warn them against me.
no,
No.
but when you get information and you're confused, come talk to me. But if you have something in your personal medical history or your family history that you are wondering about, that you're curious or worried about, I do encourage you to come see a genetic counselor, because often the conversation is really eye-opening. Just because you walk into a genetic counselor's office doesn't mean we're going to test you or not test you. It's really a conversation of, what do you want to know? What are you here for? What do you meet criteria for? How do you feel about this information, and what are you going to do with it? So you can go to nsgc.org, find a genetic counselor in your area, or ask your primary care doctor. But if you have those questions, come see a professional, because the internet has a lot of great information and a lot of very bad information. So just make sure you're getting your information from the right sources.
Dr. Cohen?
nsgc.org.
The National Society of Genetic Counselors. You can always look it up.
Yeah, I would end on a very positive note, which is, again, that the promise of this is enormous. I think it's going to roll out a little slower than Robert thinks, but I think the promise of this is enormous. We owe it to ourselves to do more study of our genomes and our genes. And if you're going to do it, though, I would say go to Robert's lab, because it'll get done right. But you have the right to go someplace else. Lastly, please participate in research and support research in this country. The NIH has suffered terribly through the last 20 years in terms of the funding, and the promise of the future requires that we do biomedical research and find out how to better diagnose and better treat people in all medical fields. So please volunteer for research. Please support legislators who understand that if we're going to do something about Alzheimer's disease, or about diabetes, or about schizophrenia, it's only going to come through research.
And I just have one last question. Did anyone change their mind about getting their genome sequence tonight? Saying for the positive or no? Anyone said, now I want to get my genome sequenced? Anyone said, I'm not going to do it? How interesting.
Just a few minds.
You have a few of
both
each.
directions.
Never change a lot of minds. But we hope you had a great conversation with us, and we'll see you out for some wine and beer outside. That's great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you all again for coming, and we do want to give our panelists another round of applause, and Beth especially. Give them a chance to go out in the atrium, and they'll answer questions for you. And please visit the NECIR table and also the WGBH table and become a member, become involved. And thanks again for coming.